One of the things that's interested early scholars about the Epic of Gilgamesh is that the Epic of Gilgamesh contains another ancient account of a prehistoric flood, a worldwide flood. So what is it about this flood? What are the parallels between the flood of Gilgamesh and the flood of Genesis? And how does it all fit into the story? Well, let's talk about that. How the flood shows up in the story, we know that Gilgamesh has just lost his best friend Enkidu. He's wandering about. He determines he's having an existential crisis. He needs to find out how to obtain eternal life. At one point he looks at himself, he says, will you too die as Enkidu did? So he's having this little bit of a crisis. He goes to Mount Mashu, and he meets these fantastic creatures along the way, the scorpion guardians. He meets Urshanabi, the ferryman who takes him to Utnapishtim. He meets Sid Uri, the barmaid, who tells him life is all about eating, drinking, and be merry. Embrace what you have in life because you will one day die. And Gilgamesh is not accepting this. He goes to Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim, he is the one who survived the flood. So please keep that clear. Gilgamesh was not in the flood. He goes to the man, Utnapishtim, who survived the flood. And I want to talk a little bit about this because this is really, really interesting. There's a list, and this is one of the interesting points here, is there's a list of Sumerian kings. And the Sumerian kings extends back to the pre-flood days. And one of the interesting things about it is the time frame, the time span of these kings' lives is incredible. Some are stretching 10,000, 20,000 years. We say, well, that's kind of crazy. No one can live that long. But we find after the flood occurs, this recorded flood, and the flood is actually recorded in the Atrahasis epic, spelled Atrahasis. So if you want some more information about the flood, go to the Atrahasis epic. The Atrahasis epic essentially says the gods got mad because humans were making too much noise, so they sent this great flood. But the interesting thing is prior to the flood, we find that man lived 10,000, 20,000 years, which is sort of interesting because in Genesis we find these huge lifespans, 800, 900 years before the flood, and then at the flood, Noah, it was deemed that Noah should only live 120 years. Well, that man's life would be shortened after Noah. I don't know if Noah actually lived 120 years or if he lived a little bit longer. I should know that right offhand, but I don't have his age. But anyway, so it's sort of an interesting parallel that we have these long lifespans prior to the flood, and then after the flood we have these more regular lifespans that we can understand. So Gilgamesh goes to Utnapishtim and says, I want to live eternally like you do. Utnapishtim says it's impossible. I survived the flood and the gods granted me this gift to live eternally. But here's the interesting thing. There's some parallels between the flood that Utnapishtim survived and the flood that Gilgamesh survived. Okay, so we have the flood narrative of Gilgamesh. In the flood narrative of Gilgamesh, we find that Utnapishtim is warned of an impending flood, and he's told to build a boat, which he builds in 7 days. In the Genesis account, God warns Noah of an impending flood. Noah builds a boat, and it says God sent rain after 7 days. So we have a very strong parallel there. In Gilgamesh, the boat came to rest on Mount Nimush, and in Noah's account, it came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So in both these stories, we have a boat landing in some mountains. But that's not all. We also have Utnapishtim, when he's checking out the waters to see if there's any dry land, he releases 3 birds. He releases a watchbird, a swallow, and a raven. Noah also releases 3 birds, a raven, and then twice a dove. So again, we have the same, in terms of number, we have 3 birds released. And then we find Utnapishtim, after he actually comes out of the boat, he offers a sacrifice to his gods following the flood. And we find Noah doing the same thing. So we have a very, very similar tale right there. But there's more than just the flood narrative that's a parallel between these two texts, the Genesis text and the Gilgamesh text. We also find this idea of eternal life. In both texts, eternal life is found in a plant. In Gilgamesh, the eternal life is found in a plant that grows beneath a river or beneath the waters. In Genesis, we know that it's a fruit from a tree, but eternal life exists in plant life. But who steals the eternal life in both texts? A snake. Again, another strong parallel. So it's just kind of interesting. We have these two ancient texts from around the same region, because we know one of the things is that Abraham, who was the father to the Hebrews, which the Bible is their text, he was from the Mesopotamian region, actually quite close to the city of Uruk. So if you do some of your research, you'll find some really neat parallels. So are these two stories just recounting the same events, but as in any two people recounting something that happened? They're going to tell it in their own way. They're going to tell it a little bit differently. I don't know, but it's really fun and interesting to consider.